get started then. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining in to our second episode of my webinar series, HR Talks. Today, we're going to be discussing how the global pandemic has impacted women in leadership. I'd like to start off the webinar by introducing our panelists. So first, we have Elaine Zapotosny, who is the owner of Ascent Coaching and Consulting. So Elaine, so nice to see you. And if you could please provide a quick introduction of yourself.
Sure. So I think you said most of it, which is I am the owner and principal of Ascent HR Coaching and Consulting. My practice focuses on leadership development and organizational change and team effectiveness, and absolutely thrilled to be here and spend some time talking about this topic, because women in leadership is one of my passions. So pleasure to be here with all of you.
Wonderful, thank you. And next we have Sonia Edmonds, who's a partner at BDO Consulting. So Sonia, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you could also provide an introduction.
That's great. Thanks, Kristen. Again, I'm Sonia Edmonds. I'm really happy to be here. I am a partner at BDO Canada, and I lead our BDO consulting practice, and that's a team of 600 professionals across the country. And we focus on risk consulting, management consulting, as well as technology consulting. So I'm very happy to be part of this panel discussion today.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, we have Vince John, who's Senior Manager at TD Wealth. Vince, so great to have you join us today. And why don't you also provide an introduction? Can you hear me, Vince?
Oh, okay. Thanks, Kristen. I don't know if it was really slow there. Yeah, you cleared up at the end there, so I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
My name is Vince John, and it's very nice to meet everybody. So to Kristen's point, I've been in the FI and insurance industry. I keep saying a few years, but it's been 20 now. So I'm getting a little bit older and longer in the tooth, but always been in HR and focused on a lot of talent. So a lot of what I've been focused on as of late is how do you actually build effective talent strategies in a very quick growing and volatile industry, which is fascinating and absolutely love it. And the last 4 or 5 years I've been actually involved with women in leadership and helping from an HR lead on those pillars, which I'm passionate about as well. And it's been quite fascinating, a great journey.
Wonderful. Well, it's so great to have you all here. And so just for the audience, in terms of how we'll structure the webinar today, so we have some research and some questions that I'll be asking the panelists to create more in-depth conversation on our topic. We will leave some time at the end for audience questions, and I do welcome anyone to please add any questions that they would like us to address today into the webinar chat. We had some questions sent to us earlier that I'll also address today, but questions are very welcome, and we'll be sure to leave some time for that. So in terms of my research as I prepared for the webinar today, one thing that I found fascinating was the stats and the data that I came across from a global perspective were the exact same stats and data that I came across when I looked at North American numbers, which I found fascinating. And certainly, without question, COVID-19 has created an unprecedented crisis for us all. And what I've come across is that, specifically the economic crisis that we've come across has really exposed deep structural inequalities around the world with a disproportionate effect on women. In a matter of weeks in the spring of 2020, COVID-19 rolled back 3 decades of advances on women's labor force participation and setting the Canadian economy up for a much slower recovery than would have otherwise been the case. And despite notable rebounds in our employment and in GDP, the pandemic continues to cloud the future for many industries in which women have had significant representation. What's more is the pandemic has made the family responsibilities that women typically shoulder that much heavier. And so today we're now set up with this divergent and very troubling trajectory that's seeing Canadian women continue to retreat from the workforce. And a few of the stats that I came across, and I'll cite some from the Canadian Women's Federation, women in 2 cohorts are exiting the labor force faster, and that's women between the ages of 20 and 24 and 35 and 39. Women are more exposed to hardest hit industries and overrepresented in industries that have less conducive to working remotely. And we do see women highly represented in industries that have been hit very hard by COVID: retail, childcare, travel and accommodation. And women exiting the labor force face the risk of an erosion of skills. So to talk a little bit more about sort of state of the union and existing impact, Sonia, start off with you. What do you feel an organization can do to get a better understanding of how this has impacted their business and what the long-term consequences can be?
Yeah, so thanks, Kristen. So, I can speak for businesses like BDO. We're trying to take a very proactive approach in understanding how have we been impacted, and how is this going to impact our business going forward as well. And really, we're taking a look at our own stats to see different areas of business to try to recognize, how are we being impacted by this. And really, like anything, I feel that the first step is, acknowledging that we have a problem or that there's something to actually address here. And, being purposeful as leaders in trying to recognize that and figure out what to do about that. And in terms of long-term consequences, to me, it comes back to the thinking or the reasoning behind why we started to really focus on the need for gender diversity in the first place. So, what was the value and what value are we seeing with better gender diversity? And, for my personal background, my focus is primarily, again, our consulting business, but a big part of our business is actually technology focused. And that's an area where gender diversity has always been a challenge. It's a very male dominated industry. I lived through it myself. And we're certainly, we have a priority focus in making sure that we have a much more balanced workforce. And really, if you think about the rapid pace of change of technology and the impact that even like things like AI are going to have for us in the future, without diversity, we'll have a very narrowed view of what's being developed that we're all being impacted by. So, these are things just kind of reflecting on why did we push for diversity in the first place, to try to understand what kind of consequences we'll have by not actually dealing with this.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Well, it's interesting. Sorry, Chris, I was going to say one of the things, Sonia, that we were looking at, I'm sure you guys were as well. It's always been there, but it's even more paramount now is, yes, there's obviously a social reason as to why we're doing this, but it makes business sense. Like, I can't think of a business in the industry where it actually isn't just a good business decision to have a diverse workforce. Mm-hmm. And so it's a slight tweak in vantage point, but the energy that you get from a business when you look at it from that point of view, it's just another business initiative, as we actually have, numerous business initiatives, and it's just the right decision to make. Absolutely, there's a social component to it, but that business piece is starting to actually become a top priority.
So Vince, much of our data reports that women are most likely to sacrifice career and economic advancement opportunities to accommodate caregiving. So school closures, household isolation are moving the caring for our children from the paid economy, so babysitters, daycares, to the unpaid one. Based on your experiences, what have you seen and what have you heard organizations are currently doing to address this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kristen, and one we're probably still trying to rifle through and figure out. But I'll focus on a couple of things that I think that I've seen starting to work, or at least at the sense it opens the doors of communication. And the first one is communicate. And the reason I bring that up, and I'm so passionate about it, is when you actually look at our workforce, if you look at our female colleagues, everybody is going to actually come from different life stages, different vantage points themselves. So to resist the urge to paint everything with the same brush. And so in order to be able to do that, though, is how do we encourage our leaders to really lean in to these discussions with your actual teams? And probably more so, even though we probably should always be doing it, be really intentional about it in this type of environment. Because while there's some benefits in virtual when we're actually working from home, one of the challenges is there's a tendency that you could get disconnected. You can get disconnected from the culture, you can get disconnected from your teammates, and it could be just like, if anybody remembers that movie Groundhog Day, where you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So how do you as a leader ensure that that doesn't happen, and that you're talking you're making it a priority with your folks to talk about their career, and then be flexible in this environment with what those outcomes are. So I'll look from one pole to the other. If you think about the first pole, it's okay to say no, you don't want that initiative. And that's actually not a reflection or is going to be actually a detriment to your career. If anything, the concept of even saying no is building a skill set for yourself building up that confidence within yourself to say, I know what's a priority right now and I know what isn't, and being able to actually do that. I find that that's actually a struggle, or can be a struggle, not only with female colleagues, but for a lot of folks, because you're afraid to say no. And say, well, like, how's this going to actually look upon me? So I think it starts from us to be able to actually invite people to say, that's okay. And then for development, I say, how do we actually get creative in our development? So one of the things that we speak about is, listen, if folks do want to get development because we don't want learning to stop, how do we actually start to do that in this type of environment? So as an example, how do you actually start to wipe things off from someone's desk to ensure that maybe they can actually put this on their desk? How do we ensure that if someone wants to actually get creative with an opportunity, that we actually align them to that opportunity in a unique way, but in an intentional way? But how do we start thinking outside of the box? And that takes a lot of heads to be actually put together to say, how do we can actually make that happen? And give those and communicate those opportunities to individuals. Because a lot of times, folks, if I call myself in HR, I'll have the luxury of seeing something at a higher level vantage point. But if you're actually, knee deep in your initiative, you might not necessarily see the options. You might just say, I have these initiatives. I can't do that because I have this, and this to do. So to be able to actually communicate that, to say, no, there's actually a solution to this, and here's what this looks like, and give those opportunities and the way to be able to actually, the art of the possible is actually the word I was trying to figure out there. And let them actually then venture out and see if that's something as a female colleague that would be actually beneficial to them. I think then the third thing is, and this is one that we actually have been learning about as well. We made an assumption that, well, this is something that, we all should be doing on our own, but we've been very intentional in terms of how do we actually build out more mindfulness type of direction, more mindfulness type of development. And that won't be us, because we are by far not the experts, but engage experts who know this. We automatically assume that this is a skill set we should all know, but frankly, we don't. And so how do you actually start to balance, like if you have a young family, or you have parents that you're taking care of, or you have kids that are in college, whatever the case may be, how do you actually provide tips in terms of how do you become mindfulness? How do you actually handle the different stresses that are coming to your life? How do you actually frankly handle the things that we're not anticipating, like COVID, and being able to actually deal with that? So that's one thing I would say that we have found in spades, an enormous amount of positive feedback saying this is what I needed. But those are just a couple of focuses that we've had.
Yeah, and I think, aligned with what Sonia had said, and further to what you said, I think an important part is the intent is there to help solve the problem, and that there's a reminder of why this is so important to have diversity, and especially at that leadership level. One of the questions that came in just now asked about, what are the different impacts on women leaders, such as CEOs, right? Because obviously we're speaking kind of women in general, right? But the focus of the webinar actually is to dive into a little bit further on the women leadership level, because certainly we know that if we're seeing this exit of women leaders, then those spots are filled, and they're not ones you can just simply come back to. So before I kind of jump to your question, Elaine, is there any, with respect to this question right now, Vince, Elaine, or Sonia, is there anything that you would like to add specific to women in a leadership level and the impact of them, juggling the work-life balance, or whether that's children, or whether that's elderly parents, or whatever it may be? And then secondly is, do they have to compromise their career or take a step back as a result of having to juggle that?
Yeah. I think the piece I would add around women leaders, so not necessarily from a data perspective, I can imagine the data extends to women in leadership. I wonder if it's more dramatically, and so that's a question mark, but women in leadership have an even greater responsibility or pull on them, because not only are they impacted themselves, but they're also helping their teams who are dramatically impacted. So it can feel like an additional weight that they're bearing, because as a leader, any leader, you are worried about what you have going on, and usually more worried about your team and how they're doing. So, my discussions with clients, female clients, that is an even greater responsibility they are bearing during these times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sonia.
Yeah, no, I was going to echo a bit of what Elaine was talking about. Like I feel that, being responsible and as a leader, and we have many women leaders in our organization, and, they're all pulled in the same direction that we're talking about women in general, right? And even though many of the leaders in our organization are not leaving the workforce, they're still trying to, they're still falling to where they're the primary caregiver and things like that, and feel the most impacted by children having to stay at home and whatnot as well. And they're all at different ages and stages of their life and their career. And, having that role as a leader, I think, one thing that I've recognized is that I see our women leaders stepping up a lot more to have that kind of proactive view of what else is happening to the rest of our team. So not just the women leaders and women within our team, but what's happening, and how do we think of different ways to try to make sure that we've got flexibility and allowing for those things. I think that many organizations that are in a very positive state and viewing the fact that diversity, and this is an important issue, recognize that, that even women leaders may be going through this as well, and are, trying to find ways to I don't want to just say accommodate, but, allow for that, and making sure that they're okay too. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree, Sonia. And I was going to say, even when to build off that, one of the things that we spoke about with our leaders, including our female leaders, is how do you ensure you're vulnerable with your teams to talk about what's actually going on? And that is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Especially at the onset of this. There was this notion as leaders, because there was so much trauma and turmoil going on with and anxieties with our teams, that this notion of, as leaders, our shoulders should not bend, like put it on our shoulders. And it was actually the opposite behavior that aligned your teams, to say it's great to actually say your shoulders bend and you're struggling with this too. And I find that a lot of our female leaders, at least the ones that I've associated, were just so strong in connecting that way. And not only did that help their teams, but it actually also helped to give permission as a leader, ironically, to be able to balance those things, because now it's not something that you're trying to hold or keep away. It's something that you're speaking about with your team. So you're almost, it's a double positive, where you're communicating as to what's going on with your life, but you're actually giving your teams permission to be able to weigh in there as well.
So, further along to, Sonia's point around, the discussion around why we wanted to have a more diverse workforce, and the importance behind ensuring that we do our best to maintain that. And I had referenced that, we already had some systemic issues that, as a global community, we had been working to help counter. Elaine, given that this global impact of COVID is layered on top of this already existing systemic issue, if it's left unaddressed, what do you feel will be further exacerbated by the pandemic? And how do you feel that women or allies at that senior level, at a leadership level, resolve this? Because it's going to fall on to the leaders of an organization.
Yeah, so the short answer to the first part of the question is, even by your data, we have lost decades of work, and it will continue to be exacerbated. The risk is there, and it will continue as long as we are in this pandemic. I think it just is. And so how we move to resolve or almost reshape it, I think what's really important is that, because we've been so significantly disrupted by the pandemic, in the midst of disruption, what we have the opportunity to do is build back better. So this was President Joe Biden's thing, and I thought I loved it, build back better, because if we think about it, the first thing to building back better is acknowledging that we have a male-dominated power structure. That's what our organizations have been predicated on, and there's systemic bias that sits in organizations. It's there. And so we need to acknowledge that it's there in order for us to build something different. You know, as we rewind decades and decades, men comprise the large part of the workforce. And so that's how our organizations have been built, have evolved, and you know, just seeing that it's there, I think, is an important first step. And then I think in the midst of this build back better idea is rethinking what leadership is, and what it needs to be for everyone, for across genders, across race, like for everyone. And I actually think we are starting to see a new definition of what leadership is emerging. I mean, you can, in all of the literature and everything you read, you can feel that there is this cry for a different kind of leadership. So I think that's part of building back better. I think the other thing is understanding that gender roles are socially constructed, right? We are inculcated in these roles, and these constructs that we have about what gender and even what leadership is around that, they often run unconsciously for all of us. And so one of the things that I think is really important to reshape is that we're paying attention to our own narratives, our stories, our beliefs about our roles, about our gender roles, because these are long entrenched ancestrally, goes back years and years. And so the way to do that is being conscious. Vince, you talked about this piece about mindfulness, you know, awareness of, and connecting it to what is running unconsciously in our organization. The way to bring things into consciousness is to have practices that will actually allow you to become more conscious of the gender bias that's sitting there. Tasha Urich's book called Insight, she talks about the fact that 95% of us think that we're self-aware. So it kind of speaks to this whole awareness and mindfulness piece, when in actual fact, only 10 to 15% of us are self-aware. So think about, so I think if you were to ask anybody, are you, you know, do you consider yourself aware? That everyone say, yeah, I'm pretty self, 10 to 15% of us. So there's just such an opportunity for us to shift when we become more aware of the things that are running unconsciously for us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, it's interesting being a female leader myself. You know, I thought your point, Vince, around, you know, showing that vulnerability, it is a hard place to come to, not to show vulnerability, but because you want to be strong for your team, and because this is such an ambiguous time, and you know, there's no previous experience that we can really pull from, and so you want to at least show people that you've got it, you know what you're doing, and that you know, that they can at least feel confident in your abilities. But the truth is, then there's no relatability. And so you do need to show, hey, I'm struggling too. And I think also, kind of to the question we had before, it's important that, you know, not only are you showing that vulnerability, but you're showing things that you're doing to counter some of the challenges that you're coming across, or things that you need from people, and making, you know, kind of to the earlier point you said around having to say no, showing people that there's not consequences to people on your team if they say no, or they share that they're struggling, or they share that they need support, that they're having a bad day, they need a mental day, personal day to be able to address. And so if you start to make that okay, and you create that language, and you create the support around that as a leader, you know, again, juggling that, you don't want to show you're crying every day, because obviously everyone's going to be very concerned about you. But I think it's, you know, and that's how I will show my frustration. That's why I reference that. But, you know, I think it's important that the more that you make something acceptable, just like we've come a long way, I think, as again, a global community from a mental health perspective, and how people can start talking about that and being more open. And so I think a lot of it is conversation, a lot of it is intent. And I think it's also really starting to do deeper work within ourselves as individuals, but also as organizations, and especially at the leadership table, to to proactively address this and proactively show support and proactively create the communication, the language for it.
Yeah, Kristen, it's funny what you said really resonated, because if you think about in all our careers, there's always been some sort of leadership competency like managerial courage or the ability to be authentic. It's always been there.
Mm-hmm.
I think this year has really blown that up, saying it's not only a skill set that we should always have, it's going to be crucially important in this year. And when you see, like, if we see our female leaders, to your point, Kristen, it's about, let's use the ability to say no as an example. If you see a senior leader being able to do that with the logic and the thinking that went behind it, you instantaneously give people permission under your own team to do that.
Mm-hmm.
People will copy what they see above you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a lot of, and we've all seen that. I'm a culprit as well. Sometimes I'll theoretically say something, but I don't behave that way. So I'm probably in that unawareness piece, Elaine, on the majority side, where I'm unaware of a lot of things, but it's, how do you ensure that what you do, your team will follow? And I've been lucky enough to see a lot of our female leaders do that. And you see a direct correlation with how the team actually responds with it for their own personal decisions that they have to make. There's a freedom in it.
I would also say that in itself too is very culture setting, right? They're setting the tone for the organization and what the norm becomes and what's acceptable and what's not, right?
Absolutely. And I think that leads us to kind of, the next sort of part of our discussion, which is, it's important to have sort of a balanced view of everything, right? And so obviously I always say to anybody who knows me, there's pros and cons to everything, right? And I think that there certainly are some positives that have come out in some ways for women. Many of the reports and stats that I read, alluded to women having an opportunity to be seen as role models, kind of along the lines of what we were just discussing. And Vince, in your forums and in your discussions, what are some of the positives that have been discussed and highlighted through this ongoing change?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Kristen. And so I'll preface to say, listen, a lot of this sucks. It's because we want to be connected with our loved ones. What was that?
I said there's more negatives than positives. I would agree.
I love being connected with our teams, and so there is a different. Yes.
Oh, I think
you're starting to see some of it come to life. The one I'll call out that is actually really, really pivotal. We've learned as a society how to work virtually. And it's interesting because, it's been something that's been spoken about for a long time. Like, how do you work from home? How do you work remotely? And instantaneously, regardless of your industry organization, a majority of them, unless you were frontline, were working from home. And by and large, we figured it out. And so there's been, technology that's been put in place in a lot of our organizations. There's been infrastructures. There's been confidence in terms of how do you actually operate in a Zoom or WebEx type of environment. Those are all skills that no one can take away from us. And while we don't know what the world will look like in terms of what virtual will look like when our world gets back to normal, what we can probably guarantee, it's going to be somewhere interjected depending on the organization as part of the day-to-day. That can be a bonus. That can only be a benefit when you think about our world returning to normal and you have that work-life balance and the freedom to be able to actually do that, knowing that it's been done. So I think that that's something that will be really exciting. Ironically, I think there's been deeper connections depending on the teams, and not because we can't see each other, but because of the types of intentional conversations some leaders have been leading with their teams. Like, I've had conversations with some of my leaders that I've never had in person before, and it's drawn us closer. It's helped us to build better connections and deeper connections. I think that's been a huge bonus when it comes to just our daily interactions. Now, don't get me wrong. My personal belief is, listen, there's a value in being in person to a certain degree. It builds culture. But when you're actually, having these deeper conversations, you can take that culture to another level. And I think that, in some pockets, that's been happening. From a leadership perspective, and Kristen, you and I spoke about this a bit, but I said, what was amazing is you've seen some of our female leaders really lean into the inspiring leadership piece of their day-to-day interactions with their teams. And what I mean by that is, when you're looking at high-performing organizations, there obviously is a focus on initiatives and the drive and motivation to get those initiatives out. That will never go away. But I think now what we've seen is that this whole piece about how to build connections with your teams, how to motivate your teams, how to actually just build followership within an organization, I think you start to see that it's actually become not just a nice to have, it's equally as important to actually get that drive and motivation from your teams. And I've seen a lot of our female leaders just naturally lean in. And what's been awesome about that is you start to actually see their names being spoken about in a lot of talent discussions, not only in my group, in tons of groups outside of my industry and colleagues that I've spoken to. You're starting to see a direct correlation of how that skill set is really valuable in this world, and it's evident in this world. And so I think that's been an unhidden, or it's been a hidden bonus that is starting to unhide itself.
Yeah, and that would lead me to my next question, because I think, women are traditionally, stereotypically, but traditionally seen as more nurturers, more compassionate. So Sonia, do you feel that women were, quote unquote, more prepared for, this ambiguous time and for the juggle that work home life has created at that senior leadership level?
Yeah, well, I think it also comes into the style, right? I think women in leadership just generally have a different style, and that might feel more inclusive. And, at the risk of offending some of my male colleagues that are also very inclusive, like, I would say that, yes, I think that the reality is that they may have been better prepared because there is this natural juggle in their role prior to the pandemic. So, leaning into those types of things that, those skills that were developed naturally for completely other reasons, I think have actually benefited women in leadership. And again, that whole inclusive-ness and the way of the leadership style just being different, I think has really benefited women, where, women generally, again, not to offend our male colleagues that are very good at this too, but, they generally will listen more rather than waiting for their turn to talk, or, also look to seek input from multiple sources. And that doesn't mean that they're less decisive. It just means that they're more informed before they're making those decisions. And in turn, that kind of creates a different kind of culture for that environment too, where people feel that they're part of a more inclusive environment. So, I think that comes along with that, again, the experience of just naturally having to juggle all the way through their career, and, that it's helping them for sure.
Right. And even if it's not, again, like, typically when someone's referring to work home life balance, a lot of it can be led to believe that it's about children, but there's lots, we've seen it coming for years, but there's a lot of women who are left to care for their parents or other people in their family, a lot of, so kind of holistically that juggle. And even if you don't have kids, again, stereotypically, a lot of the caregiving at home or the management of home life can fall to women. And again, when you think about it from a global perspective, for sure. And so when we're referring to that juggle, obviously it's, in all kind of aspects. Elaine, do you feel that women women leaders have a more inclusive, quote unquote, inclusive vision of leadership, coming from one that champions diversity or that's more collaborative? Because again, these are stereotypes, but with your conversations with clients and through your data and research, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, and I'm biased, and I know that, and I'm putting it out there. But yes, my experience is that women are naturally growth seekers. They're learners, and they are willing to examine their beliefs and their narratives so willingly. They're willing to kind of go into discomfort. And it's kind of those qualities that I think, Vince, your point earlier about the uncertainty and the ambiguity, I think that's what allows women to step so beautifully and be powerful human beings in this space, because they're willing to go there. We're seeing on the global and the national scale, women stepping into these influential roles and leading in the pandemic. And I believe that that's happening. What's happening on the national and global scale, that's happening in our organizations and our communities. Bob Anderson and Bill Adams wrote a book called Scaling Leadership, and they have a leadership development firm. And one of the pieces that they offer is a 360 assessment. And they did some research, had a third party company do research or do a survey on the their assessments. And specifically when they looked at women leaders, their study revealed that women leaders rated 15 to 20% percentiles more in the creative self-authorship over their male counterparts. And so this idea, so their definition of creative is being in the more self-authored space. And when you're in self-authorship, you're able to more effectively set boundaries. You are more effectively able to say no. You're able to come out of safety and be in purpose mode more effectively. And so 15 to 20%, it was remarkable. And the other really interesting fact in this same study was that women, if they compared kind of women and men who were in low effectiveness, and as they were moving towards high effectiveness leadership capabilities, they were actually able to drop their more reactive tendencies at a ratio of 2 to 1 over men. And so these things that will make them less reactive, they were able to shed them much more quickly and step into their self-authored step. So in spades, yes. And my sense, and as I think about this from ally perspective, so our male allies that are on the call that have women in their teams, how can you bring more of that out of women? The women on this call who see that in themselves, how do you double down on that in this time from a development standpoint? There's such great opportunity in this word. I think Vincent and Sonia both use this word intention. I think women are apt to set that intention much more readily for various reasons. And they lean into this growth and learning orientation just so beautifully.
So that leads me to the sort of final part of our webinar around, what are solutions? And, ideally, when you're looking at a problem, kind of both sides of the coin of that problem, it's great to discuss solutions. And it's not like, oh, this happened before, just use this solution, it'll solve the problem. Just hire more women or protect, women and leaders or women in general, but at a leadership level, just accommodate them more. I mean, it's not that simple. Elaine, what do you feel, what are some recommendations for women to leverage this time from a developmental perspective? Because obviously to continue, Vince, you'd reference, continuous learning, or your plate is being so full that your opportunity to learn and grow and challenge yourself or to develop yourself and continue to build yourself as a leader is limited. There's only so many hours in the day, and especially when they're compromised between work and home, as an example. And so, how do we continue to develop ourselves as women and continue to grow as leaders? And so, Elaine, any thoughts around that?
Oh, yes. So a lot of thoughts about this. Nick Petrie wrote a white paper at the time he was working for Center of Creative Leadership, and he identified 3 things that were important in leadership development, is leading edge leadership development. And by the way, I think this applies to all of our development. So everybody who's here, he talked about the fact, so the first thing he talked about was find heat-seeking experiences. And heat-seeking is like something that's going to kind of push you way out of this is your heat-seeking experiment right here. This is, so you need not look any further than leveraging this opportunity for your development. So you don't necessarily, because there is so much happening and so people are stretched so far. I'm not suggesting you go look for a new development opportunity. It's you leverage this one to move you. The second thing he talked about was finding later stage development mentors and coaches to be able to help move you along. So to just give you a short commercial, there is a bunch of research in the last 25 years around how adults develop. So not learning, but development. And so in that, finding a late stage development person, I encourage everyone on this call to learn about how you develop, so that you can, when you actually find and understand the space you're in developmentally, it actually helps you understand where it is you need to go, and therefore how can you create space for your team. So the further along my development I am as a leader, I can create spaces for other people in which they can come and share their concerns and all the things that we've talked about. So later stage development is really predicated on someone that has moved along their self-authorship path, along their self-transforming path. Anybody that is interested in information, I have a bunch of resources that I would love to share with you. So I will put my email in the chat window. So learn about it and find, so look at who is in your development circle right now. Who do you have a mentor? Are you mentoring? Because that also is a development. Is your leader at a later stage development than you are? If not, can you augment that? Is there a peer that could help you? Like all of those things to be able to help move you along. And then the last one is creating space for elevated sense making. And sense making is how I'm thinking about my thinking. So often we can sit in rumination, we can sit in worried about what's going to happen, worried about, did I mess up, did I fail, did I make a mistake? So that's being in your thinking. What I'm suggesting is thinking about how you're thinking about things. Spending time there, reflection time, journaling time, whatever it is, so that you're actually acutely thinking about how you're making sense of things and how can you reframe or change your mindset about those things. And there is no time other than what we're sitting in right now that I can think of that would be a better time to do that.
And this ties a lot back into the self-awareness portion, right? As to what you referenced earlier. Yeah. Sonia, what are some of the impactful strategies that you would recommend to organizations that have, such as BDO as an example, but have women leaders that are impacted by COVID in one or more ways?
Sorry, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm on my cell phone. Something happened to my laptop. We gotta love technology, right?
I know, right? We were ready for it.
I'm sorry. Kristen, can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah,
I just
rejoined. I was just curious, what are some of the impactful strategies that you would recommend to organizations like BDO as an example, but who have women leaders that have been impacted by COVID in one or more ways?
Yeah, so I'll make a few comments. I mean, not to state the obvious, but of course, COVID has been impacting everybody on completely differently in different ways, men and women. And really, we as leaders, whether it's men or women in leadership, need to recognize those things for our team, our women leaders, and everybody really, just to try to look at how can we create some flexibility and be creative about that flexibility. So, some of the things that we've done is in parts of our business, it's not actually critical that we employ a 9-to-5 structure. And, having flexibility within the day to allow for, gaps in time, or as long as this work is completed, we really can't, it doesn't matter what hour of the day, that type of stuff might be an opportunity to explore. And I think the other thing just to kind of keep in mind too, is that the reality is that, we culturally still have a lot of, I don't know, I want to say domestic roles assigned to women, or, whether, and it's unconscious for sure, but it still happens, right? If you think about in-person meetings and, women are typically cleaning up afterwards, or in meetings, maybe that women tend to do the note-taking if there isn't an administrative person already assigned. So, trying to be purposeful about thinking about those things, to say perhaps, rotate who's on point for taking notes each time, and that sort of thing would be, things to think about. And then just lastly, I just want to mention too that I think it's really important that we're thinking about mental health and wellness. And, as an organization, what are we doing for not just our people leaders, but for our people around making sure that they feel safe, they've got ability to, you may even want to create like a women's group chat or something like that to share life hacks, like how are other people adapting to some of the challenges that they're facing, and finding different forums to either create. So those are just some of the things that I've seen happen, and thoughts that I have around that.
No, I love that. And it's funny, I've read a lot recently around, or just sort of the beginning of this year, around like flexibility. And flexibility used to mean, oh, you can work from home from time to time. And now we're obviously all at home. And so flexibility really has changed in terms of what it's meaning. And I agree with you. I think it's providing flexibility within that day or within that week, so that somebody can, manage all of the things that they need to. And I think you raise a really important point around mental health, right? So I think in some of this, one of the key strategies, I think, to support the workforce in general, but as we're specifically talking about women leaders today, women leaders is, providing some support from a mental health perspective. We have EAP programs, there's digital solutions that can support, them. And then, and finally, any sort of benefits program that you have, but being mindful of that being a key component, I think, is very important. Go ahead, Vin.
Sorry, I was going to say, Kristen, one of the things about mental health that really resonated to me was when we were in the office, or when a majority was in the office, you got those checks just by sometimes walking out of your office and sitting down in someone else's offices and talking, and that was all gone. Like in an instant, it was gone. And we've done, like, I think across different organizations, leaders have done a good job in connecting, but we said, how do we up it and make the connection disruptive? And what we mean by that was that spontaneous piece of connecting, where it's just a random phone call. There isn't going to be a book meeting. It's not going to be so mechanical, and just say, hey, Kristen, how are you doing? And how do we start to engage from a mental health perspective, a culture of caring, where we can actually attack in different ways? Ironically, we said some of the best ways we've been connecting is old school, phone, and not by video. And some people are saying, this is actually the most engaging conversation I've had over a phone. And so how do we try to attack this from different ways, but be as spontaneous as we can be in this way? That there's a freshness that comes from that. And how do we actually take time out of our day to be able to do that for one another?
And in your conversations, Vince, with leaders, what are some of the strategies, or in addition to what you just shared, but any other strategies or recommendations that you would share to them as individuals, or to how they help lead their teams through this time?
Yeah, I would say for starting from the leaders, and I'll go down to the individual contributors, but for our leaders is really leaning into, let's not just talk about maintaining development and career development, but let's actually make it better. So I think at first we were all like, oh, let's make sure like we just try to maintain what we've done. It's like, well, let's get rid of that actual notion. Let's actually make it better. And a lot of that stems from the leaders. And so as especially as female leaders, how do you build those intentional connections? How do you actually start reaching out and being an ally as a senior leader within your group? So as for instance, we'll have young female employees who are new, and there is always a certain sense of intimidation when you're new to an organization, especially if you started in this environment, to connect with senior people. How about we reach out? How about we flip that table and we reach out and provide that pathway of connection? How are we really, and I use the word intentional a lot, but I think intentional makes sense here, intentionally build out pipelines. I know it's always been kind of the strategy to actually build out our diversity pipelines, but even more so now, how do we start doing those connections, not only internally, but externally as well? And make sure that it is just something that is ingrained in us to be able to do that. So a lot of it stems from the leaders. Now that said, when I flip it, how do we actually ensure that then as individual contributors, you have the courage to voice what it is you want to do.
Mhm.
So don't be shy, don't be timid, put it on the table. Like, this is what I like to do. And then trust that the leaders will have the honest conversations with you as to how do you actually, what's the map then to be able to get there. But it stems from your passion first. And if
Mhm.
that passion is that you want to move into other roles, if that passion is that you just want to focus on your role, because it's fluid, it's just for a point in time, and giving yourself a permission to be able to gear up and gear down as situations change. But a lot of that stems from the leaders to be able to create that pathway to be able to do that.
Mhm.
The last thing is allies. We hear a lot about allyship.
Yeah.
And I would say that from an ally's perspective, whether you're a male ally or even if you're in a leadership role as a female to be an ally, how do you get to know the people that you're actually trying to be an ally for? So I use this statement saying, we love to back people up that we care about. That's instinct.
Mhm.
If it's family members, you don't need to call them an ally. You'll protect them
Mhm.
because you care for them.
Mhm.
And so how do you ensure that you get to know people that are different than you?
Mhm.
Take the risk of putting your foot in your mouth. You may have not had any intention, but you may have offended. That's how you learn. And don't be afraid of that. And so as an ally, it's like, how do you seek to understand? And then the more you understand, the folks that you're trying to get to know, the better of an ally you'll be. It'll be instinct.
Mhm. So a couple questions that came in that were somewhat similar was, two kind of parts is, one, what for a new female leader, so somebody who's a new manager who is also contemplating taking some time off work at some point for maternity leave. How do they, they're taxed with having to build some credibility, some momentum as a new leader, and then to potentially compromise that or feel that they're compromising that by taking that time off. Sonia, maybe I'll direct this to you to start, but any advice or recommendations for a person that finds themselves in that spot?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really it's a sensitive one because I think perhaps the angle of the question is, what do I do? How will people view me? As somebody that potentially will be going on maternity leave soon, and especially if you're new to management, that you really want to show up well too, right? You want to do a good job, and you want to show that I was put in management for a reason. And not give excuses as to why you might need something more or that sort of thing. So it's definitely a challenge. But the one thing that I'll say is that it really is driven by even the culture or the leadership of that organization, right? To make sure that there is an environment that does not allow somebody like that to not be included because they're thinking about starting a family or something like that. And I know I saw some of this, years ago, where I found out I had taken over leadership of a group, and I found out that as soon as somebody became pregnant, they started to get excluded from meetings.
Yeah.
And the second I caught wind of that, I just, I was like, heck no, that's not happening, right? And they added incredible value to today, and just because they found out that they're going to be starting a family is not the reason that they all of a sudden lost all their value. And we have to find ways to make sure that there continues to be a path for people that will take a break, men or women, because of family reasons and things like that, we foster an environment that actually allows for that and knows that that we're bringing people into leadership and into management because of what the value that they have been adding, and not to diminish that. So I think that the culture and the environment, first of all, as an organization, is critically important, but it's really leadership's responsibility to make sure that that is actually there, right, for our team.
Yeah. Actually, I have a girlfriend. She works for Manulife, and this was many years ago. So over 15 years ago actually, and she had taken maternity leave. She had a baby and she got promoted while she was on maternity leave, and I thought that was the best thing, because you don't hear, you at the time anyway, you hadn't heard of that often. And I thought, wow, like what a great organization to really value and recognize her contributions, and for her to come back and see that her career has an opportunity to continue to grow. And she was also a female leader as well. Vince or Elaine, anything you wanted to add to that question?
Yeah, so I will share a personal example, and my leader at the time is on the phone. I became pregnant, brand new in a job, 6 months in, and was horrified because it wasn't planned, horrified. I'm like, what's gonna happen? And my leader embraced me, Karen embraced me like there's no tomorrow, and said, my goodness. And so Sonia, to your point, it is about what we create for people, how they are held when these things happen, that is critically important. And I think the other piece, and Sonia, you touched on it, which is where we are. So if we are in our self-authored space, we actually feel very comfortable saying, look, this is what's happening. And so the further along we are towards our self-authorship, the more we're going to be able to stand in our shoes and say, I'm pregnant and this is what's happening, and and for myself, I'm going to be okay in that space. So working towards that is really critical for us, so that we can stand purposefully and say, yeah, this is it, and have leadership there to help support us.
I just see we have a 3 minutes left. So Vince, anything you wanted to add to that before we wrap up?
No, just other than repeating Sonia, I mean, culture drives all of that. So for folks to actually be able to be comfortable, and I reported to Elaine actually when that actually happened, that culture was there to be able to talk about it. It's as simple as that.
That's great. Well, for everyone on the panel today, thank you so much for your time and your contributions, and just having the opportunity to discuss this further. We will be sending out a link to the webinar for today to all the participants, anyone that's registered. And obviously everyone on the panel is available. If you have additional questions, you can reach out to any of us. But we really appreciate everyone's involvement and participation today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Enjoy the rest of your days. Bye, everyone.